Well, hello there again, my pine cones. It's YaYa here with another episode of Storytime with YaYa and Papa Moon. All right, so today's episode is going to be from Percy Jackson and the Olympians, Book 1, The Lightning Thief by Rick Riordan. So we are on Chapter 5. I play a Pinochle with a horse. I had weird dreams full of barnyard animals. Most of them wanted to kill me, the rest wanted food. I must have woken up several times, but what I heard and saw made no sense, so I just passed out again. I remember lying in a soft bed, being spoon-fed something that tasted like buttered popcorn, only it was pudding. The girl with the curly blonde hair hovered over me, smirking as she scraped drips off my chin with a spoon. When she saw my eyes open, she asked, "What will happen at the summer solstice?" I managed to croak, "What?" She looked around as if afraid someone would overhear. "What's going on? What was stolen? We've only got a few weeks." "I'm sorry," I mumbled. I don't. Somebody knocked on the door and the girl quickly filled my mouth with pudding. The next time I woke, the girl was gone. The husky blonde dude, like a surfer, stood in the corner of the bedroom, keeping watch over me. He had blue eyes, at least a dozen of them, on his cheeks, his forehead, and the back of his hands. When I finally came around for good, there was nothing weird about my surroundings except that they were nicer than I was used to. I was sitting in a deck chair on a huge porch, gazing across the meadow at green hills in the distance. The breeze smelled like strawberries. There was a blanket over my legs and a pillow behind my neck. All that was great, but my mouth felt like a scorpion had been using it for a nest. My tongue was dry and nasty, and every one of my teeth hurt. On the table next to me was a tall drink. It looked like iced apple juice with a green straw and a paper parasol stuck with the maraschino cherry. My hand was so weak I almost dropped the glass once I got my fingers around it. "Careful," said a familiar voice. Grover leaning against the porch railing, looking like he hadn't slept in a week. Under one arm he cradled a shoebox. He was wearing blue jeans, Converse high tops, and a bright orange t-shirt that said Camp Half-Blood. Just plain old Grover, not the goat boy. So maybe I'd had a nightmare. Maybe my mom was okay. We were still on vacation and we stopped here at the big house for some reason and "You saved my life, Grover said. Well, the least I could do. I went back to the hill. I thought you might want this." Reverently, he placed the shoebox in my lap. Inside was a black and white bull's horn, the base jagged from being broken off, the tip splattered with dried blood. It hadn't been a nightmare. "The Minotaur," I said. Percy, it isn't a good idea." "That's what they call him in the Greek myths, isn't it?" I demanded. "The Minotaur, half man, half pole." Grover shifted uncomfortably. "You've been out for 2 days. How much do you remember? My mom, is she really?" He just looked down. I stared across the meadow. There were groves of trees, a winding stream, acres of strawberries spread out over the blue sky. The valley was surrounded by rolling hills, and the tallest one directly in front of us was the one with the huge pine tree on top. Even that looked beautiful in the sunlight. My mother was gone. The whole world should be black and cold. Nothing should look beautiful. "I'm sorry," Grover sniffed. "I'm a failure. I'm the worst Satyr in the world." He moaned, stomping his foot so hard it came off. The Converse high top came off. The inside was filled with styrofoam, except for a hoof-shaped hole. "Oh, sticks," he mumbled. Thunder rolled across the clear sky. As he struggled to get his hoof back in the fake foot, I thought, well, that settles it. Grover was a satyr. I was ready to bet that if I shaved his curly brown hair, I'd find tiny horns on his head. But I remembered I was too miserable to care that satyrs existed, or even minotaurs. All that meant was my mom really had been squeezed into nothingness. It dissolved into a yellow light. I was alone, an orphan. I would have to live with Smelly Gabe? No, that would never happen. I would live on the streets first. I would pretend I was 17 and join the army. I'd do something. Grover was sniffling. The poor kid, poor goat, satyr, whatever, looked as if he was expected to be hit. I said, "It wasn't your fault." "Yes, it was. I was supposed to protect you." "Did my mother ask you to protect me?" "No, but that's my job. I'm a keeper. At least I was." "But why?" I suddenly felt dizzy, my vision swimming. "Don't strain yourself," he said. "Here." He helped me hold my glass and put the straw to my lips. I recoiled at the taste because I was expecting some kind of apple juice, and it wasn't that at all. It was chocolate chip cookies liquid cookies. And not just any cookies, my mom's homemade blue chocolate chip cookies, buttery and hot, with the chips still melting. Drinking it, my whole body felt warm and good and full of energy. My grief didn't go away, but I felt as if my mother had just brushed her hand against my cheek, giving me a cookie the way she used to when I was small, and told me everything was going to be okay. Before I knew it, I drained the glass. I stared into it, sure I just had a warm drink, but the ice cubes hadn't even melted. Was it good? Grover said. I nodded. What did it taste like? He sounded so wistful, I felt guilty. Sorry, I should have let you taste. His eyes got wide. No, that's not what I mean. I just wondered. Chocolate chip cookies, I said. My mom's, homemade. He sighed. How do you feel? Like I could throw Nancy Bobofet 100 yards. That's good, he said. That's good. I don't think you could risk drinking any more of that stuff. What do you mean? He took the empty glass from me gingerly, as if it were dynamite, and set it back on the table. Come on. Sharon and Mr. D are waiting. The porch wrapped all the way around the farmhouse. My legs felt wobbly trying to walk that far. Grover offered to carry the miniature horn, but I held onto it. I'd paid for that souvenir the hard way. I wasn't going to let it go. As we came around the opposite end of the house, I caught my breath. We must have been in the north shore of Long Island, because on this side of the house, the valley marched all the way up to the water, which glittered about a mile in the distance. Between here and there, I simply couldn't process everything I was seeing. The landscape was dotted with buildings that looked like ancient Greek architect, an open-air pavilion and an amphitheater, a circular arena, except that they all looked brand new, their white marble columns sparkling in the sun. In a nearby sandpit, a dozen high school-aged kids and satires played volleyball. Canoes glided across a small lake. Kids in bright orange t-shirts like Grover's were chasing each other around a cluster of cabins nestled in the wood. Some shot targets at an archery range. Others rode horses down a wooded trail. Unless I was hallucinating, some of those horses had wings. Down at the end of the porch, two men sat across from each other at a card table. The blonde-haired girl who'd spoon-fed me popcorn-flavored pudding was leaning on the porch rail next to them. The man facing me was small, but porky. He had a red nose, big watery eyes, and curly hair so black it was almost purple. He looked like those paintings of baby angels. What do you call them? Hubbubs? No, shrubs. That's it. He looked like a cherub. It's a cherub, not a shrub. Cherub. That's it. It's a cherub. He looked like a cherub who turned middle-aged in a trailer park. He wore a tiger-patterned Hawaiian shirt, and he would have fit right in one of Gabe's poker parties, except I got the feeling this guy could have out-gambled even my stepfather. That's Mr. D, Grover murmured to me. He's the camp director. Be polite. The girl, that's Annabelle. Chase. She's just a camper, but she's been here longer than just about anybody. And you already know Sharon. He pointed at the guy who was looking back at me. First, I realized he was sitting in the wheelchair. Then, I recognized the tweed jacket, and then the thinning brown hair and the scraggly beard. Mr. Bruner, I cried. The Latin teacher turned and smiled at me. His eyes had that mischievous glint that sometimes got in class when he pulled a pop quiz and made all the multiple choice answers B. Ah, good, Percy. Now we have 4 for Pinochle. He offered me a chair to the right of Mr. D, who looked at me with bloodshot eyes and heaved a great smile. Oh, I suppose I must say it. Welcome to Camp Half-Blood. There. Now don't expect me to be glad to see you. Thanks, I said. I scooted a little farther away from him because if there was one thing I'd learned from living with Gabe, it was how to tell when an adult had been hitting the happy juice. If Mr. D was a stranger to alcohol, I was a satire. Annabeth, Mr. Bruner called to the blonde. She came forward and Mr. Bruner introduced us. This young lady nursed you back to health, Percy. Annabeth, my dear, why don't you go check on Percy's bunk? We'll be putting him in a cabin 11 for now. Sure, Sharon. She was probably my age, maybe a couple of inches taller and a whole lot more athletic looking. With her deep tan and her curly blonde hair, she was almost exactly what I thought a stereotypical California girl would look like, except her eyes ruined the image. They were startling gray, like storm clouds. Pretty, but intimidating too, as if she were analyzing the best way to take me down in a fight. She glanced at the minotaur horn in my hands, then backed at me. I imagined she was going to say, "You killed a minotaur," or "Wow, you're so awesome," or something like that. Instead, she said, "You drool when you sleep." Then she sprinted off down the lawn, her long hair flying behind her. "So," I said, anxious to change subject, you work here, Mr. Bruner?" Not Mr. Bruner, the ex-Mr. Bruner said. I'm afraid that was a pseudonym. You may call me Sharon. Okay, totally confused. I looked at the director and Mr. D. Does that stand for something? Mr. D stopped shuffling the cards. He looked at me like I just belched slightly. Young man, names are powerful things. You don't just go around using them for no reason. Oh, right, sorry. I must say, Percy, Sharon Bruner broke in, I'm glad to see you alive. It's been a long time since I made a house call to a potential camper. I'd hate to think I'd wasted my time. House call? My year at Yancey Academy to instruct you. We have satires at most schools, of course, keeping a lookout. But Glover alerted me to you as soon as he met you. He sensed you were something special, so I decided to come upstate. I convinced the other Latin teacher to take a leave of absence. I tried to remember the beginning of the school year. It seemed like a long ago, but I did have a fuzzy memory that there had been another Latin teacher my first week at Yancey. Then, without explanation, he had disappeared and Mr. Bruner had taken the class. You came to Yancey just to teach me? I said. Sharon nodded. Honestly, I wasn't sure about you at first. We contacted your mother, let her know we were keeping an eye on you in case you were ready for Camp Half-Blood, but you still had so much to learn. Nevertheless, you made it here alive, and that's always the first test. Grover, Mr. D said impatiently, are you playing or not? Yes, sir, Grover trembled as he took the fourth chair, though I didn't know why he should be so afraid of this pudgy little man in a tiger print Hawaiian shirt. You do know how to play Pinochle, Mr. D eyed me suspiciously. I'm afraid not, I said. I'm afraid not, sir, he said. Sir, I repeated. I was liking the camp director less and less. Well, he told me, it is, along with gladiator fighting and Pac-Man, one of the greatest games ever invented by humans. I wouldn't expect all civilized young men to know the rules. I'm sure the boy can learn, Sharon said. Please, I said. What is this place? What am I doing here? Mr. Sharon, why would you go to Yancey Academy just to teach me? I asked the same question, Mr. D snorted. The camp director dealt the cards. Grover flinched every time one landed on his pile. Sharon smiled at me sympathetically, the way he used to do in Latin class, as if to let me know that no matter what my average was, I was his star student. He expected me to have the right answer. Percy, he said, did your mother tell you nothing? She said, I remembered her sad eyes looking at me over the sea. She told me she was afraid to send me here, even though my father had wanted her to. She said that once I was here, I probably couldn't leave. She wanted to keep me close to her. Typical, Mr. D said. That's how they usually get killed. Young men. Young man, are you bidding or not? What? I asked. He explained impatiently how to bid in Pinochle, and so I did. I'm afraid there's too much to tell, Sharon said. I'm afraid our usual orientation film won't be sufficient. Orientation film, I asked? No, Sharon decided. Well, Percy, you know your friend Grover is a satire. You know, he pointed the horn in the shoebox, that you have killed the Minotaur. No small feat either, lad. What you may not know is that great powers are at work in your life. Gods. The forces you call the Greek gods are very much alive. I stared at the others around the table. I waited for someone to yell, not, but all I got was Mr. D yelling, oh, a royal marriage, trick, trick. He cackled as he tallied up his points. Mr. D, Grover asked timidly, if you're not going to eat it, could I have your Diet Coke can? Oh, okay, all right. Grover bit a huge shard of the empty aluminum can and chewed it mournfully. Wait, said Sharon, you're telling me there's such a thing as God? Well now, Sharon said, God, capital G, God, that's a different matter altogether. We shan't deal with the metaphysical. Metaphysical? But what are you talking about? Gods, plural, as in great beings that control the forces of nature and human endeavors, the immortal gods of Olympus, that's a smaller matter. Smaller? Yes, quite. The gods we discussed in Latin class. Zeus, I said. Hera, Apollo, you mean them? And there it was again, distant thunder on a cloudless day. Young man, said Mr. D, I would really be less casual about throwing those names around if I were you. But they're stories, they're myths to explain lightning and seasons and stuff. They're what people believed before there was science. Science, Mr. D scoffed. And tell me, Percy Jackson? I flinched when he said my real name, which I had never told anybody. What will people think of your science 2,000 years from now? They will call it primitive mumbo jumbo. That's what? Oh, I love mortals. They absolutely have no sense of perspective. They think they've come so far. And have they, Sharon? Look at this boy and tell me, have they? I wasn't liking Mr. D much, but there was something about the way he called me mortal, as if he wasn't. It was enough to put a lump in my throat to suggest why Grover was dutifully minding his cards, chewing his soda can, and keeping his mouth shut. Percy, Sharon said, you may choose to believe it or not, but the fact is that immortal means immortal. Can you imagine that for a moment, never dying, never fading, existing just as you are for all of time? I was about to answer off the top of my head that it sounded like a pretty good deal, but the tone in Sharon's voice made me hesitate. You mean whether people believed you or not? I said, exactly. If you were a god, how would you like being called a myth, an old story to explain lightning? What if I told you, Percy Jackson, that someday people would call you a myth, just created to explain how little boys can get over losing their mothers? My heart pounded. He was trying to make me angry for some reason, but I wasn't going to let him. I said, I wouldn't like it, but I don't believe in gods. Oh, you better, Mr. D. murmured, before one of them incinerates you. Grover said, please. He just lost his mother. He's in shock. A lucky thing, too, Mr. Don't D. grumbled, playing a card. Bad enough I'm confined to this miserable job working with boys who can't even believe. He waved his hand, and a goblet appeared on the table, as if the sunbeam... No, hang on. Somebody's calling me. Pause.